Welcome to this session on Object Theories of Intentionality. Introducing Brentano's principle and Hofler's distinction. The theory of intentionality, as we have seen in the contributions of various philosophers in the last 4 units, has to resolve two fundamental problems. The first is the problem of non-existent objects. The second is that of referring to the same object in two or more different ways. For instance, if you are thinking of the morning star and I of the evening star, we are both thinking of the same object but under two different aspects. Casimir Twardowski, who was a student of Franz Brentano, took up these problems in his book On the Content and Object of Presentations. Before we begin to analyze how Twardowski addressed them, we need to understand Brentano's principle and Hofler's distinction. This is because both of these serve as a background to the discussion. The basic statement of Brentano's theory can be summed up thus: appearances or phenomena are directed towards objects that have intentional existence. In other words, a mental act is intentional only if it is an object. This is Brentano's principle. It was with this principle that all his students started to formulate their propositions on intentionality. The first philosopher to make a distinction between the object and the content of a mental act was a student of Brentano called Alois Hofler. Hofler states that the content of the presentation and the judgment lies as much within the thinking subject or individual as the act of presentation and judgment itself. The words thing and object are used in two senses. On the one hand, for that independently existing entity to which our presentation and judgment is oriented. On the other, for the mental picture of that real entity which exists in us. This approximate picture that we have in our minds is more or less identical with the content that Hofler mentions. As against the thing or object which is independent of thinking, the content of a presentation and judgment is also the intentional or immanent object of these mental phenomena. Hofler thus makes a clear distinction between act, content, and object. These form the basic concepts of the content theory of intentionality, which we will study in the next unit. Hofler also says that the object is extra-mental while the content and act are intra-mental. He could very well have used these concepts to address the two basic problems mentioned in the introductory paragraph. If he had used them to that effect, he would have arrived at the explanation given right below. As for the first problem, that is to say of non-existent objects, we can apply his concepts in the following manner. When I imagine a unicorn, my act of imagining has the content unicorn. However, it does not have an object because there are no entities in the external world that correspond to this content. In other words, the content unicorn fails to choose an object in the real world. As for the second problem, which is that of referring to the same object in two or more different ways, this is to how it can be addressed. When I think of the morning star and you think of the evening star, we have different contents in our minds. The content in my mind is morning star and that in yours is evening star. But the interesting thing is that both these contents choose or identify with the same object in the actual world, the planet Venus. These simple solutions did not occur to Hofler, who stopped at the distinction between act, object, and content. It was two other students of Brentano's, Twardowski and Meinong, who took it from there and came up with solutions. Twardowski's distinction between content and object. According to Twardowski, the term presentation can be taken to mean either the act of presenting or the content presented. But this is not enough. The content must still be distinguished from the object presented. Twardowski illustrates the differences between the object and the content by comparing their relationship to that between a landscape and a painting. In comparing the act of presenting with painting, the content with the picture and the object with the subject matter which is put on canvas, for example a landscape, we get a sense of the relationship between the act on the one hand and the content and the object of the presentation on the other. For the painter, the picture is the means by which to depict the landscape. He wants to represent or paint a real or merely imagined landscape, and he does that by painting a picture. Both the landscape and the painting are painted, but obviously not in the same way. The landscape is the primary object of his painting activity, and the picture is a secondary object. Similar is the case of presentations. An individual presents to himself some object, for instance an oak tree. In doing so, however, he presents to himself a mental content. The content is the copy of an oak tree in a sense similar to that in which the picture is the copy of the landscape. In presenting to himself an object, a person presents to himself at the same time a content which is related to this object. To sum it up, what is presented in a presentation is its content, whereas what is presented through a presentation is its object. Twardowski defended his distinction between content and the object using the following three propositions. Firstly, he argued that the content of all acts always exists. If the object and the content were merely two different aspects of the same thing, it would be impossible to explain how sometimes only the content exists, while the object does not exist. Let us take the case of the unicorn for instance. The unicorn does not exist in reality. In other words, there is no such object existing as the unicorn. Nevertheless, when someone says the unicorn does not exist, the judgment that he makes is a content. This content exists in the consciousness of the person who makes the judgment. This argument in short entails that if the object and the content were the same thing, they would always occur together. The objects of act that are directed to non-existent objects do not exist. The content of all acts necessarily exists. Secondly, Twardowski argued that the properties of contents and of objects are different. For example, a golden mountain has the following properties. It is stretched out in space, that is on the surface of the earth, and consists of gold. In relation to other mountains, it may be large or small. All these properties do not belong to the content of the presentation of a golden mountain. The content which is in the mind is not stretched out, nor does it consist of gold. The comparison in terms of size with other mountains also does not apply to it. Thus, all these properties do not apply to the content but to the object, even if it does not exist in reality. Therefore, if the object has properties that the content cannot have, then the content and the object are distinct entities. Twardowski's third argument has to do with different presentations that have the same object. He calls them equivalent presentations or exchangeable presentations. For instance, the presentations the city located on the banks of river Yamuna and the seat of the Indian Parliament have different contents, but they refer to the same object, Delhi. Twardowski asserts that if the content and the object of a presentation were the same entity, it would be impossible to account for equivalent presentations. If one, however, reads Twardowski carefully, one would notice that he does not mean that acts referring to non-existent objects do not have objects. Instead, he argues that even these acts have objects but not existent objects. This notion of Twardowski's is in sharp contrast to the content theory of intentionality because for the latter only existent objects are objects at all. A content theorist would say that the expression non-existent object of a mental act contains a contradiction. Meinong's object theory. Meinong, who was another student of Brentano's, also drew a distinction between object and content and based this distinction on three propositions. He said objects may not exist in reality, that is, they may be non-existent, but contents are as real as the mental acts whose contents they are. Meinong also introduced the feature of temporal determinations in his distinction between content and object. He said, we may have at the present moment a presentation of a future or past event. The content of this presentation is present whereas its object is not. He also added that the objects of mental acts can be either mental or physical while the contents are necessarily mental. According to Meinong, anything that can be thought about is an object. Even the statement what cannot be thought about refers an object. Even the non-existent round square which I hold in my hand is an object for Meinong. The properties of an object constitute its essence in nature. For Meinong, the properties of an object are independent of its existence. Thus, a golden mountain has properties even though it does not have existence. Therefore, statements ascribing properties to non-existent objects are not meaningless. On the contrary, they have both meaning and truth value. This is to say, they are either true or false. Meinong distinguished between three levels of being: existence, subsistence, and being beyond existence and non-existence. Concrete matter like human beings, individuals, stones, trees, cars found on the planet Earth exist. They are in the realm of existence. Abstract objects and states of affairs, for instance the number 7 and that tomorrow is not Wednesday, subsist. They are in the realm of subsistence. Objects outside these two realms belong to the third level of being. It is using this distinction that Meinong asserts that every act has an object at some level of being. He thus addressed the problem of reference to non-existent objects by evolving new objects on new levels of being. The second problem, that is to say, referring to one object in two different ways, still persists. Let us look at the concept that Meinong developed to address this problem. If I think of the morning star and you think of the evening star, we are not thinking of different objects. However, Meinong argues that whenever there are two different contents, there must be two different objects. He adds that the same is true when there are two different references or expressions in language which indicate two different meanings. Hence, if I think of the star that appears in the west at sunset and you think of the star rising in the east, we are both ascribing different properties to the objects of our thoughts. If different sets of properties constitute different objects, we have different objects of thought. We must remember that for Meinong, such formal properties as existence, possibility, simplicity, and completeness do not belong to the nature of an object. Only natural properties like color, shape, extension, hardness, and texture belong to it. If formal properties belong to the nature of an object, there would be contradictions. The individual natures of existent objects are extremely complex because they have innumerable properties. Meinong observes, no human intellect can exhaust the infinitely many properties of even the least conspicuous real objects. Really existing concrete objects are complete objects. This is because it is possible to say of each complete object whether it has a given property or not. For instance, it is impossible to measure the height of every concretely existing mountain, but not that of the legendary Golden Mountain. The Golden Mountain is therefore an incomplete object. One cannot say that an incomplete object has or does not have a particular property X. Hence, with respect to the property X, an incomplete object is incomplete or indeterminate. Incomplete objects have an important part to play in human consciousness and therefore knowledge. According to Meinong, complete objects can never be really present to the mind because they have infinite properties. In order to have a presentation of a complete object, an incomplete auxiliary object is needed, since an incomplete auxiliary object has only a limited set of properties and can therefore be presented to the mind. For instance, to see a car, one should have an incomplete copy of the car present to one's mind. This mental picture of the car is the auxiliary object through which the ultimate object, that's the car itself, is seen. Generally, ultimate objects are complete. However, it is also possible that an incomplete object, that is one's own mental picture, is the ultimate object of one's mental act. This is the case, for instance, when one thinks of the fancy purple car in the showroom. Meinong's content theory. Meinong writes, we are bound to use auxiliary objects even in understanding incomplete objects if the latter have more properties than can be presented to our minds by the presenting contents. Thus, all complete objects and some incomplete objects must be presented through auxiliary objects which are incomplete. Something worth noticing here is Meinong's use of the word content, indicating that there is a relationship between a content and an incomplete object. The question here is, are content and incomplete object one and the same thing, or are they different? How does Meinong's incomplete object resonate with the content in content theory? In this module, we will look at these questions. This serves as a backdrop to our discussion in the next unit, which is on content theories of intentionality. Meinong says that it is the content attached to the auxiliary objects that helps the presentation of an object to the mind. Auxiliary objects belong together with the meanings of word to the class of an abstract objects. Meinong in fact claims meanings of words are very often auxiliary objects. If Meinong's incomplete objects correspond with contents in content theory, he has no problem of referring to one object in two different ways. Although Meinong's auxiliary objects perform the same function as the contents in content theory, there is a difference between the two. Meinong's view is that the auxiliary object is contained as a part in the ultimate object. In other words, the image in my mind of a bird is a part of the bird that flies and builds its nest in the trees. Since anything that can be thought about is an object, both the bird and the image of the bird are objects. For Meinong, these two objects are similar because one, the complete object, contains the other, the incomplete one, while for content theory it is not so. Content theory states that existing objects are both objects of mental reference and the ultimate constituents of the world. It also does not hold the view that all mental acts refers to the objects. Instead, some of them can refer to states of affairs or events or processes. Additionally, it also distinguishes between successful reference, that is, mental acts that have objects, and unsuccessful references or mental acts that do not have objects. Meinong, on the other hand, does not believe that acts without objects can exist. This proposition of Meinong's ultimately entails two things. It means every mental act has an object, and that every object that has an auxiliary object essentially has an ultimate object too. Let us summarize what we have discussed in this topic. In this unit, we tried to familiarize ourselves with some of the propositions of the object theory of intentionality. We looked at the contributions made by the students of Franz, Brentano, Twardowski and Meinong and how these contributions helped address two fundamental problems. The first is a problem of non-existent objects. The second is that of referring to the same object in two or more different ways. The very step in the resolution of these two problems was Hofler's formulas of distinctions between act, content and object. We saw in the second module how his concepts can be applied to resolve the first problem using the example of unicorn. In the third module, we engage with how Meinong addressed the problem of reference to non-existent objects by evolving new objects on new levels of being. In the fourth, we briefly discuss how Meinong's postulates on incomplete objects and the contents of content theory are similar to and different from each other. Now, try to answer the given questions. How does Twardowski illustrate the differences between the object and the content by comparing their relationship to that between a landscape and a painting? Explain with an example how, according to Meinong, we are bound to use auxiliary objects even in understanding incomplete objects. What of an object, according to Meinong, constitutes its essence of nature? What are the three propositions that Twardowski used to define his distinction between content and object? Let me suggest some books for your reference. Phenomenology, Basing Knowledge on Appearance, Zion Avi, Geneva, Zion 2003. Introduction to Phenomenology, Moran, Dermot, London, Routledge 2000. Thank you for watching this program. We can meet again for another unit. Till then, take care.